Hello, family, and welcome to the Actualize Earth podcast. My name is Juicy Life, and I figured I'd start by doing a little bit of an origins of both my life, this work, this podcast, and really set up a good frame of reference to point back to in future podcasts so that you can learn more of where this is coming from, why it exists, and also how to get involved. So, as I shared, my name is Juicy Life. Obviously, this is a chosen name, and I'll share a little bit about that. My birth name is Tom Bassett. And interestingly enough, I'm actually at my parents' house, the house that I grew up in central Illinois, to share this origin story podcast with you. My origin story is unique, but it's also part of a larger path, part of a larger expression of humanity. And that's really what this podcast is about exploring. The hero's journey, this journey of actualization, of becoming highest self, living on purpose, living in highest expression. So as we go through these podcasts, as we connect with people and hear about their journey of actualization, their hero's journey, the gifts that they bring out on the other side to share with the world, and the opportunities available for people in their journey of actualization that these people are sharing and bringing. This is an opportunity to get that high level connected experience with why it exists, why I'm even here doing this, and what it's about. So I'll start with where I'm at. I'm at my home in central Illinois, at my parents' house. My parents are, like for all of us, a highly influential factor in our growth process. We pick up codes from them, both on the positive and also challenging side. We pick up their traumas, we pick up their subtle unconscious patterns, and they can actually be sometimes hard to reprogram. But for me, I'll start with some of the benefits of where I came from. And, my father was a city manager in this town that I grew up in. And my mom's father was a police chief of one of the Chicago suburbs. And interestingly enough, was one of the longest serving police chiefs in Chicagoland history for over 20 years. Now, I believe that this has informed my journey. It wasn't something that I necessarily knew as a child, that it would form my direction in life, but civic orientation, city manager, police chief, people who take care of the community, who see the larger whole and recognize that they have an important part to play in the well-being of a community. I just happen to take that to the next level with technology and also study of intentional community and a number of other things that I'll get into here in a little bit. But that lineage is really important to me, just like it is in all of our lives. So for me, I had a challenging childhood in my own right. Um, Even though I had extraordinarily loving parents, I was shaped by my culture. And this is something that no parents can protect their child against. Um, One of the big things that was impactful in my journey and going through the shadow was around being 12 years old and thinking about suicide. Um, Number of factors including close friends moving away and a bully picking on me, and just the challenge of, my getting my mom to quit smoking cigarettes and hearing her cough to sleep every single night, thinking that and coming to the realization that she was going to die. And this all hit in a very short time period, and it was really overwhelming for me, especially thinking of being 12 years old and 9 more years of education that I was already not feeling connected with. And fortunately, it only lasted for a short period of time. But the depression that followed was almost a decade long. And I didn't really start my journey of awakening, if you want to call it that, until I was living by myself in the middle of nowhere in Wisconsin. I actually had an LSD experience that I was able to look back on my life and see all the things that had unfolded. I was able to see what the benefits were to me being more insular, to being less socially connected. I also saw the challenges and what I wanted to change in my life. I wanted a relationship. I wanted community, even though I didn't necessarily have the word for it at the time. But that's really what started me on my journey. And I look back and I saw the, playing the sports, golf and baseball and, you know, uh, soccer and, all these things that kept me engaged physically. And I was really grateful for the physical being that I have become. And I also was really grateful for the education that I was able to more focus on because I had that space and it was less filled with social connections and these things. I ended up getting my degree from the University of Illinois in chemical and biomolecular engineering. Uh, I was fortunate enough to also work in a lab, actually a couple in college, and do research in the chemical engineering department, which I loved, and it was so formative for me. And actually, how I got started was, interestingly enough, from the racquetball team that I joined my freshman year in college. That's what got me started in programming. I was actually programming in high school with the TI 83 plus calculator in the back of class, but first web programming, I was on the racquetball team and I was taking pictures at tournaments and the president of the team was like, "Hey, can you create a website that isn't Facebook to share this content?" And so I did my first round of it. And my sophomore year in college, I wanted to join a lab. I reached out to a few professors, and the head of the chemical engineering department reached out to me and he said, "Hey, you know, do you know how to make websites? Because I have an engineering ethics book that I would really like to be available online." And so he said, "If you make that website for me, you can join my lab." So I started that and I learned about a little bit more about programming. Um, and I then got into the lab and was doing thin film deposition of titanium dioxide to, learn how to do thin film deposition. And I ended up moving into another lab that was doing microfluidics. And so I got to do some really amazing research in college. Somehow they even allowed me to use a scanning electron microscope and transmission electron microscope. It was kind of fun to see down to the atomic level. I was growing gold nanoplates to embed in rubber, essentially, to create these lab-on-a-chip devices. Think of the old school NES gaming cartridges that have the little pins on them, and like a little chip the size of a quarter with tiny, like sizes of a hair, channels for fluids to flow through, so that you can run hundreds of reactions in a small amount of space, which had a lot of benefits to it, uh, including running many tests, less use of active pharmaceutical ingredients if you're testing pharmaceutical things. And one of the problems that I was challenged with was most of those devices were using ecstatic or pneumatic valves. So like using air pressure to move the fluids around on the chip. But the problem is that you had to have an external valve for every valve that you had on the chip, and you had hundreds of connections, if not more, to connect to the chip. And it was a challenging thing. So if we could figure out how to move the fluids around using an electrical currents, that would be the thing that could make this lab on a chip viable in a production environment. And I learned so much doing research, and I think it's such a great teacher to experiment, to see what works, to see what doesn't. I was so profoundly grateful for the education I received in chemical engineering because it taught me physics, it taught me thermodynamics, it taught me fluid systems, it taught me quantum mechanics, differential equations, linear algebra, a lot of these high level concepts that are so incredibly necessary for the building of our modern culture and society. And by the time I got to the end of college, I realized that a lot of the work that was done by chemical engineers was actually propagating environmental uh, degradation. And I knew it could be used, for good, but I decided to follow what I was passionate about. And as I went through college, I did more websites and I learned, and that was my passion. That was my hobby. That was what I loved doing. I loved, that staying up at night sometimes and being like, oh, what can I create next? That's what really got me into the programming world. And just to briefly share, the origin of why I even went into chemical engineering was because as a kid, I remember being 7, 8 years old, driving down the road and seeing a petrochemical plant. And I'm like, that's the most complicated thing that I've seen in the world. How does that work? And that's just been this underlying voracious desire to learn how things work, to truly understand, why things are built the way that they are from the foundations of science. And as I shared briefly before, that inflection point in my life of psychedelics uh, was also one of those things that opened me up as a scientist, as an experimenter, that there's something more going on than what science is telling us. Science has also never really gave us a great definition of what consciousness is, what intelligence is, who we are as a species, why we're here. And so all of this kind of went into, now I really want to do something that's good in the world. And this came from deep challenge, as I started relating with people, with a relationship in my life. I experienced a really challenging, how I lost my virginity. And I don't necessarily need to go into the story, but afterwards I was like, why did that happen? How can I make sure that that never happens again? And that challenging moment, while it sucked so bad in the moment, was the catalyst for me to do that deeper inner work. And that's when I started learning about the chakra system. I was like, I have an engineering degree, all this energy woo-woo stuff, but then I actually started learning about it. And I realized that it had application, for me at least, to have a better clarity of what was going on in my inner world, where I could focus energy. And so that's when I started to kind of bridge this scientific and, you might say, spiritual, you might say left brain and right brain, the left brain, hardcore analytics, math and science, with the right brain, artistic, creative, holistic expression. I didn't really have the words for it at the time. I didn't really understand it, but I knew by doing this deeper inner work, like especially with the chakras, that it opened me up and it supported me in living more of the life, living more in joy, living more in that creativity and that awareness that I had been wanting, didn't know how to get to. So while I was doing that work, I ended up moving back home to live with my parents for about a year. And I was trying to do my own startup during that time. And after a few months, I'm like, I can't, this doesn't really work. I need to actually get a job. And through a wild and weird synchronistic connection, I ended up finding a job board that led me to what became my first real job coming out of college, which was a company that did real-time race tracking for marathons and large running events. I remember meeting with Jeremy, the guy who runs the company, and he was describing this to me, and I was like, oh, so you kind of want something like, Mario Kart, right? Where it's got that little tracker up at the top and it's following people around on the course. And yeah, I ended up putting in 5, 7, 8 years into doing that work. And it just happened to be during a time when, before modern frameworks existed for a lot of the stuff that now it does exist in the technology space. So I had to build a lot of it. I learned how to build a mobile app from the ground up. I learned how to build a framework from the ground up. That framework, that app that I built ended up being used and still being used by over 10 million people, localized to 8 different languages, and used in quite literally every single country around the world. Now, as I was doing this work and as I was living at home and starting this profession, I realized after a year or two that, hey, this is all digital. This is all online. I could really work wherever I want to work. Where do I want to live? Now, at that time, or 2012, 2013, 2014 or so, it became readily apparent to me that what was happening in the primary social platform that people were using, which was Facebook, that the way that Facebook was evolving was not really in our greatest interests. Back, prior around 2010, 2011, I learned so much from content on Facebook. There were so many groups that were creating such meaningful content, sharing links to resources, and I just connected and learned in so many ways. And then Facebook changed its algorithm and downranked links being shared because they wanted people to stay on their platform more because people on their platform more generated more revenue. And this was something that it was just immediately, I'm like, this is crossing a line. This is unethical. This is extraction and exploitation and manipulation. And it's honestly really only gotten significantly worse since. But with that in mind and heart was what inspired me to move to Boulder, Colorado, to continue this work with the real-time race tracking, but also to do this deeper work of learning how to live in community, to build technology. I had this vision of creating technology that would be actually in service to people, supporting people. And as a scientist, as an explorer, it felt important to me for that to be embodied. So I did a lot of work. The first place that I lived actually in Boulder was part of a condo complex. And that condo complex, I ended up finding out after about 6 months that there was an intentional community there. A group of about 10 to 15 people who would gather regularly, do monthly potlucks and do community meetings, as well as do things like a workshop on Ho'oponopono, which is something that I had never heard of before. And I learned so much. We served, part of one of the tenets of the community was service. And so once every month or two, we would go to the homeless shelter and serve food. It felt good. It felt good to be in that level of connection and community. I learned so much from it. And after about a year or year and a half, I started my first iteration. It was called GroupUp.me. And about a year into doing that work, the people in the community were aware of what I was doing and were like, hey, let's use this for how we organize in our local community. And so we did. And that was my first iteration of creating an on-the-ground experience, like using technology, not just from some, we're going to put it out there and people are going to use it and they're going to, do that thing. I was living with the people who are using it. I was getting feedback directly from them. I even, about 6 months or a year into using it, went around to every single person in the community and did an interview. What's working? What's not working? What would you like to see? And it was that feedback in any evolving system, that feedback is so incredibly crucial to its growth, its evolution, its purpose. And after a few years of doing this work and, getting about to the end of my wits of putting thousands of hours into something, and not really getting the investors that were needed to take it to the next level, I was about ready to quit, honestly. And I put a boundary up and I'm like, something needs to show up in the next month. And if it doesn't, I'm done. I trust life to show me. And during that time, I found out that there was a really amazing and perfectly aligned conference that was happening not even a month later at Sunrise Ranch in Colorado, one of the oldest intentional communities in the United States, in Eden Valley. This was the Emerging Technologies Conference, hosted by Barbara Marx Hubbard. I didn't really know her much at the time, but as soon as I got into doing research about her, watching some of her YouTube videos, I was just, wow, this woman is connecting to that same evolutionary impulse as myself. I felt less alone. I felt the deeper connection and belonging of purpose. I felt seen, even though I hadn't even met her yet. And so at this Emerging Technologies Conference, I was able to present my work on Group Up and connect to a number of other transformaries, people who are here for this planetary mission in a bunch of different domains. Many of those people are still friends today. And that was in 2017. A few months later, I was introduced to a few people in the community recommended that I reach out to this other person named Eros, who was interested in a similar thing. He had a background in building community. He had a high interest in eco-villages and creating sustainable systems for ways that we could live in the world in right relationship, in joy and expression. So after getting to know him a little bit, we decided to come together. I put Group Up to a close, and we started on the next venture called Nectar together. And it was that first time that somebody had invested in some degree to this mission, this vision. And we worked on it tirelessly. And we also enjoyed the time together. He was a brother. He was somebody who was bringing complementary skill set, complementary resources to the table, and was all in with his heart to create something that he felt was, that I felt was meaningful, purposeful, needed in the world. Now, after 2.5 years of doing this, got to a point of, oh man, it's not really growing in the way that we want, and decided to bring it to a close, which was painful. At that point, I had probably put in 4,000 to 5,000 hours of my time into doing this work. And truthfully, I was a little bit lost. I was also fairly broke. Now, I have always kind of come back to, I'm a high-level programmer and I can go out and get a 6-figure job. And so I was like, well, do I go get a job here and make money and do the thing? So I ended up going to apply to a job at Gaia, the online conscious streaming platform. And I ended up meeting with the CEO at the time, and I said no to the job just because I didn't feel the resonance with him. That felt important to me. It was crazy to turn down a $150,000 a year job with doing good work in the world and a company of 50 to 60 people who would be really amazing coworkers and friends. And even in that craziness and the unknown of it, I said no. So funnily and interestingly enough, and this is a common path in my journey, has been the synchronicities of life. I was visiting my brother in Washington State, helping him build out some stuff on his house. And I was like, okay, I really need to go back to work. The real-time raise tracking was great. I had quit that job a couple years prior to work on Nectar full-time. And I was like, it'd be great to go back to do this work. It was serving a good community. The marathon runners are so inspirational. Well, I'll start there. And it was used by millions of people. It felt like the work that I was contributing was being used and valued in the world. And so I was like, okay, I'll go back to this. The same day, I signed that contract to go back to do that work for a year. was the same day that COVID was announced in the United States, in the first case being in Washington State. Now, I took that as a sign from life. Maybe it was a coincidence, but honestly, for me, like, I just felt the deeper meaning of it that was saying, don't go back to what you were doing. That's not what you're here to do. Here's a wrench in the plan here, because honestly, I can't imagine anything else that would have stopped the global marathon running community than a pandemic. So after about 3 to 4 months, obviously nobody running marathons, I was no longer able to do that work, to do that job. And sitting in the chaos I'm sure that a lot of us were in during COVID, I I listened, and what showed up was a permaculture action day put on by a community initiative called One Boulder. And I instantly fell in love. There were people who were coming together to build community on the ground, to take practical action, to regenerate the land, to bring people together in joy. And so, I was a little bit burned out on the technology thing at that point, I'll be real. And so I was just like, I just want to be here for the community. I want to take it all in. I want to experience it. I don't want to bring tech into this. It's not what it's about for me. And after about 6 months or so, it kind of came back around that they brought on a developer. They started the tech platform. The developer left and they were kind of hanging. And so it was in the middle of COVID, and I was like, I took my breath, I took my rest, and I was like, okay, it's time. I can come back to this. And so I went into a deeper relationship and creating the apps for what became the One Boulder app. And group of people coming together. I especially want to shout out Nicholas Joyce here as somebody who I had the pleasure and the opportunity to work with and learn from, as I met him at the Emerging Technologies Conference. And also he is somebody who at the time had traveled the world for over a decade being an advisor for intentional communities. And that was deeply meaningful to me. I've always put a high priority of learning from intentional communities, of what works and what doesn't, what brings people together, why do they fall apart? And he brought a lot of wisdom. He brought a lot of trainings. He brought a lot of experiences to help the process of embodying that learning. And the short story of it, after a few years and somehow going even more negative on the money side than where I was at when I started, I got to the end of my capacity and I had $800 left to my name and no credit, and had assets of a half of a car. And I was faced with a decision point. Do I again go out and try to find that 6-figure job and do the thing to survive? Or do I lean into an experiment? An experiment that life is inherently abundant. Life brings what it needs exactly when it's needed. It's an easier thing to think about. It's an easier thing to have a belief about that. But to actually bring that down into the physical reality, surrendering, having next to no money, not knowing where money is going to come from, if I'm going to go starving, if I'm going to have a roof over my head, if I'm going to be living on the streets, that was honestly really scary. And it was also the time when I took on the name Juicy Life. And to me, it was an archetypal moment. It was an archetypal choice to say no more to the way that things have been done. There's a new orientation. That belief, again, that life is inherently abundance. To put that to the test, to see that. one of the phrases that came up for me during that time was, you know, banks say they're too big to fail, a common trope in our culture. I was like, I'm too connected to fail. I've built too many relationships. There are too many people who care about me for me to be on the street, homeless, starving. And so I put that to the test. I did a trust fall into my community. I did a trust fall into my relationships, trust fall into life, that I was provided for, that life is inherently abundance. And I started off on these nomad journeys by going to the 50th anniversary of the Rainbow Gathering, which happened to be in Colorado that year. I had actually just had my 33rd birthday, really beautiful and amazing. And it just also happened to coincide with the parade of planets. So there was like 6 planets in alignment. And I'm just like, I see these signs. I'm listening. I'm surrendering. This is crazy, but let's go. The other part of taking on the name Juicy Life was to remind myself, that life is abundant, but also to encourage myself to step into that unknown, to listen to life. Like, what is the juiciest experience that life is bringing to me right now, for me right now? What are the blocks that I have inside of me that are preventing me from stepping forward into that unknown of the experience that life is bringing me? And that was the beginning of Juicy Life. After a few 9 or 12 months or so of being nomadic and trusting, and it worked out. It worked out. And during that time, it was a shift away from one boulder, again, going into that liminal space of, man, I've put in like 6,000 to 8,000 hours worth of work into doing this. I don't know if I have capacity to keep going. And then I hit that space of, I feel like I took that rest. I know deep within my heart and soul that this is the work that I'm here to do. And so I started off on the 4th iteration called Actualize Earth, which is where we're at now. It's gone through many iterations and evolutions. And evolutionary biology has been something that I've studied a lot in this process, to learn from nature, learn from these patterns that life has already provided for us. How can we build technology? How can we build social infrastructure? How can we build physical infrastructure that is regenerative, that is actually supporting our individual and our collective well-being? Actualize as a phrase, as a name, stuck with me. It was a phrase that my dad actually shared with me early on in life, that was one of the biggest things that he learned growing up to pass on to me. And it was also stuck with me because actualization, from the psychology point of view, was quite unique in its emergence and development. Most of psychology was, what's wrong with people? What labels can we put on people? Labels have benefit, but it was always, oh, this is your problem, this is your problem, this is your problem. Actualization as a concept in the hierarchy of needs was very profound in its distinction from the rest of the psychology community. It wasn't asking the questions, what's wrong with people? It asked the question, what is right with people? What supports people in their journey of actualization being somebody who's living in their highest purpose. They're bringing their gifts to the world, that they're alive. And so he created the hierarchy of needs to based on all the data that he collected on what was working with people. That food, water, and shelter were imperative, a foundational element in the process. That safety and security on top of that were also imperative. And then belonging and self-actualization. And it also really hit me because I know in my own journey of community and talking with a number of people, there's such a starving in our community, in the majority of our culture for belonging, for community. And I was again also seeing these tech platforms, they give us a candy version of that, you know, unhealthy in a lot of ways, but that sweet immediate benefit, that little hit of oxytocin or that little hit of those chemicals that make us feel a sense of connection or belonging. And so I started down this journey of how do we bring together the resources? What helps people in their journey of actualization? And again, like, what would it look like to actualize Earth, to have a culture grounded in dignity and mutual respect, of mutual support? How can we bring these resources together? How can we use technology in right relationship? And from the evolutionary context, like, the internet is the central nervous system of the planet. How can we use it with reverence and respect to support the communication, the coordination for us to meaningfully work together? Not the attention economy, which is, hey, we're going to follow you everywhere you go on the internet, track your eyeballs and track every single interaction that you have so that we can more effectively provide you content that will keep you on the platform, because the longer you're on the platform, the more money they make. But how can we bring these resources together and connect people to the resources that are going to support them, to empower them to become the best version of themselves, and ideally get them off technology? In over a decade of living in Boulder, one of the things that I learned is that the real evolution, the real juice of life, came from going into the unknown, meeting people, hearing what wisdom they had to share. In evolutionary terms, again, the term is horizontal gene transfer. It's like two bacteria that gets introduced to an antibiotic will eventually, oftentimes, evolve to the new environment. And that is great, but the cool thing is it then shares piece of its DNA to other bacteria to support it in its evolutionary process, so that its community can adapt to the new environments. And similarly, I believe that we have that same capacity. Darwin, he said it's not the strongest nor the most intelligent that survives, it's the one that's most adaptable to change. And it feels important in this era where things are evolving so fast that we have a space where we can share these codes with each other so that we can support each other in our adaptation, our evolution, and our highest expression, individually and collectively. And that's what Actualize Earth is all about. And that's why I'm doing this Actualize Earth podcast, because there are so many people that are these beacons of light in our community who gather people, that do these workshops, that do these trainings, that bring people together in ecstatic dance, that bring people together in cacao ceremony, that host these men's groups or women's groups, that have gone through their own journey, their hero's journey of going through the challenge, the dark, the shadows that oftentimes pass down from their lineage, from their culture, to come out the other side with their gifts, what they learned from it, how it improved their life, and that purpose to then share that with others. I am beyond elated at what I've seen unfold in the last few years in Boulder, Colorado, the pilot city in which we've launched Actualize. At this point, we have 3 to 8 in-person events happening every single day: men's groups, women's groups, authentic relating, circling, ecstatic dance, cuddle parties, movie nights, game nights, and all these meaningful ways for people to connect and feel a deeper sense of belonging. And I realized that a lot of those people, these amazing community leaders, are not really having the space to have their voices heard, to have the codes that they carry shared more broadly. And so it hit me. I felt this wave of inspiration that one of the things that I can offer is to create a space, a stage, if you will, for these voices to be heard, to be seen, to be shared, and to connect people to the resources that exist within our communities to have these experiences, to learn, to grow, to connect, to feel a deeper sense of belonging. And so that's what this Actualize Earth podcast is all about. Bringing people, these community leaders, forward for them to be more seen, for their own unique individual journeys to be seen. Because again, oftentimes we live in a world, and especially on social media, where people are more often than not just sharing the bright side, the side that they want people to see. But as I went through my journey, like I shared about suicide, my life opened up when I went into the shadow of that. When I wasn't afraid to then start sharing that pain, that depth that I've gone through, that was like roots to the tree that I am becoming, that I am. Because those roots in the dark and the deep and the damp and the uncomfortable, growing into the unknown, into the soils, spreading out, while it's unseen and while it's in the dark, those formative experiences are what give the roots of that tree depth. That's what gives the roots of the tree the capacity to pull up the resources from the earth to then create what we see above the tree, the beauty. The fruits that then get generated from that tree are directly proportional to the roots that grow down into the earth. And I believe that the world becomes a more beautiful place, a more juicy place, a more fruitful place, when we each tend our own tree, grow down into the dark and the damp and the uncomfortable, to share that it's not just, we're not alone in the experience. Just like the aspen roots in a tree system connect underground, or the mycelia web that connects underground, that bridges things, that connects, that shares these resources. I believe that this is the space where we can recognize that, yes, we are our own unique individual tree, but the roots that are in the unseen, in the shadows, are really what bind us together. So my goal on this podcast is to highlight people's heroes' journeys, what challenges they faced in their life, what were the formative experiences, the drama, the trauma, the challenge, the struggle that helped them become who they are now, and highlighting the fruits of their labor, so that we may all have more opportunities to both, yes, grow our own fruits and share our art, our beauty, our gifts into the world, but also, again, connect us more deeply in the underground, in the subterranean, the shadow, the challenge space that help us feel like we're not alone in this journey, in this process. Because I believe that fruit in this metaphorical context is like art. It is our creation. It is our expression that we get to share with each other in the world. And at a deep level, I think we're all artists. And every single moment we both create and destroy. The more aware that we can become of this process, the more that we recognize the art in all things, in each other, in the world that we live in, the more we can support art, ours and others. The more art that gets shared in the world, get conscious creation that we then get to enjoy the fruits of. Whether that's music or visionary art or programming or workshop hosting or whatever it might be, acupuncture, massage. There are so many gifts and offerings for us that we can share together. And my deepest heart's desire is for more people to be aware, to be able to have the resources to help connect them to these fruits, this art. So it's easier for them to have these experiences, to enjoy and savor the art that each of us have, these gifts that we have to share with each other. So I hope you enjoyed this bit of an origin story of my own life, of where Actualize has come from and the journey that it's been on to even get to this point of creating Actualize, this Actualize Earth podcast. I hope that you enjoy the contents that comes from this, that you are inspired, that you feel a deeper sense of connection, that it helps you feel less alone, that you find the others. And honestly, in the evolutionary context, like the caterpillar to butterfly, like the imaginal cells coming together from the soup of the caterpillar to create the expression of the butterfly, my deepest heart's desire is to bring together those imaginal cells, those who are interested in creating a better world. As Buckminster Fuller said, you don't change things by fighting against the reality that exists. You create a new system that makes the previous system obsolete. I don't think that this is just some technological structure that is going to make the previous system obsolete. It's a holistic structure. It's technology, yes, but it's also the social structure. It's our governance structure. It's our monetary system. It's holistic systems designed with intention, with purpose, in service to the whole. Endo-symbiotically. Endo within, symbiosis, right relationship with. In the same process that brought bacteria together into single-cell organisms to create the organelles in the cells, to then bring cells together in multicellular organisms, to now be in this form of trillions of cells, working together for the common interest of the whole. To me, this is the evolutionary imperative that is in front of us today. Why I'm so deeply passionate about this work. Why I hope that more of these imaginal cells come together to create systems together for the common interest of the whole that we are a part of, the Earth. Thank you so much for joining on this podcast today. Wish you well on your journey of actualization. And as always, wishing you love, peace, belonging, and connection. Peace.